The revolution had been won. The British had surrendered at Yorktown in October of 1781. The most powerful military empire on earth had been forced, by a ragged collection of colonial farmers and soldiers, to lay down its arms on American soil. Church bells rang from Boston to Philadelphia. Crowds filled the streets. 13 colonies that had spent 8 years bleeding for the right to govern themselves had finally, miraculously, achieved what every European monarch had privately assured his court was impossible. The American experiment, the radical, dangerous, intoxicating idea that ordinary people could build a government, not of kings and hereditary privilege, but of laws and elected representatives, had survived its birth. And now in the bitter winter of 1782 and into the spring of 1783, it was quietly preparing to destroy itself. The army camped at Newburgh, New York, had not gone home. Peace negotiations were grinding forward in Paris, slowly, diplomatically, with the maddening pace that diplomacy always imposes on soldiers, who have already fought and bled and want nothing more than to return to the farms and families they left behind years ago. The Continental Army, the force that had endured Valley Forge, crossed the Delaware in a blizzard, fought at Bunker Hill and Brandywine and Monmouth and 100 lesser engagements whose names history would eventually forget, was waiting. Still under arms, still camped in the Hudson River Valley, still subject to military discipline, still incredibly unpaid. The money had run out long before the fighting stopped. The Continental Congress, the governing body of the new nation, operating under the Articles of Confederation, a document so deliberately weak that it barely qualified as a government at all, had been unable to pay its soldiers for months, in many cases for years. Promises had been made, bonuses, back pay, the half-pay pension for life that officers had been guaranteed in 1780 as an inducement to remain in service. And promises had been broken, repeatedly, with the casual indifference of a political body that lacked both the revenue and the authority to honor its commitments. The Congress could request money from the individual states. It could not compel them to provide it. The states, exhausted by war, burdened by their own debts, increasingly focused on their own interests, and decreasingly interested in the obligations of a national government, whose authority they had never fully accepted, largely declined to provide what was requested. The soldiers had noticed. In the encampment at Newburgh, an army that had won a revolution was slowly, dangerously, approaching the conclusion that the government it had fought to create did not intend to honor the obligations it had made. Officers who had resigned profitable careers, abandoned comfortable lives, and spent the best years of their professional existence in the service of the American cause were calculating, with the cold arithmetic of men who had run out of patience, what they had lost, and what they had been promised, and what they were likely to receive. The answer to the last calculation was nothing. And into this gathering fury, a question was forming, one so dangerous, so fundamental, so threatening to everything the revolution had claimed to stand for, that even the men entertaining it were not entirely willing to speak it aloud. What if the army simply refused to disband? What if the force that had won independence took, by military power, what the politicians in Philadelphia had proven themselves unwilling or unable to provide? What if the officers who had bled for 8 years exercised the oldest political logic in human history, the logic of the sword, and imposed their will on a civilian government that had demonstrated comprehensively its inability to govern? And what if, at the head of that army, stood the most admired man in America? What if George Washington became not the servant of the republic he had fought to build, but its master? The idea was not, in the spring of 1783, merely theoretical. It was being blind, oragestid and mido mo o yodrofai scrwn. To understand what George Washington chose at Newburgh, one must first understand what George Washington was, and what, for much of his life, he had desperately wanted to be. He was not born to greatness, though he was born to ambition. The Washington family occupied a respectable, but decidedly secondary position in Virginia's colonial aristocracy. Augustine Washington, George's father, was a planter of middling prosperity, the owner of several small farms, and the enslaved people who worked them. A man of local standing, but not the grand social prominence that Virginia's first families commanded. He died when George was 11 years old, leaving his family in a precarious financial position, and leaving his eldest son with little the substantial inheritance, nor the formal education that the sons of Virginia's leading families received as a matter of course. George's older half-brothers, Lawrence and Augustine Jr., had been educated in England. Exposed to the broader Atlantic world of British aristocratic culture that formed the aspirational model for Virginia's colonial elite, George received no such education. He never crossed the Atlantic, he never attended college. He educated himself in mathematics, in surveying, in the conduct manuals and rules of civility that he copied in his boyhood notebooks with a discipline that spoke to ambition working harder than circumstance to compensate. The social wound of his relatively modest origins never fully healed. Virginia in the mid-18th century was a rigidly hierarchical society, organized around land, blood, and the public performance of gentlemanly virtue. The great families, the Lees, the Cotters, the Brandards, the Randolphs, commanded their social world with the easy authority of people who had never needed to earn what they already possessed. Washington, watching from a slightly lower rung of the same ladder, learned early what it felt like to want something that the structure of the world made difficult to obtain. He wanted, with an intensity that his carefully maintained public composure never quite extinguished, to be regarded as a gentleman in the fullest sense, as a man of unimpeachable honor, social standing, and public reputation. The hunger for reputation that would drive his military and political career was not vanity in the simple sense. It was the hunger of a man who had something to prove. His early military career gave him ample opportunity to prove it, an ample opportunity to learn that ambition without resources produces humiliation as readily as it produces glory. At 21, George Washington accepted a commission in the Virginian militia and was sent west to the Ohio country, the contested frontier where British, French, and Native American interests collided in the tangle of forests and rivers that both empires claimed. His mission in 1753 was diplomatic. Deliver a message to French commanders demanding they withdraw from territory Britain claimed as its own. The French declined, politely, to comply. Washington's subsequent military mission, to reinforce a British position at the forks of the Ohio, ended in a defeat that helped trigger the global conflict known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, and in America as the French and Indian War. At Fort Necessity, in July 1754, Washington surrendered to a French force that had him outnumbered and outgunned, signing, in the process, a document he could not fully read because it was in French, inadvertently confessing to the assassination of a French officer, whose death had helped start the entire conflict. He was 22 years old. He was humiliated. He was defiant, he learned. The subsequent years of frontier service in the French and Indian War shaped Washington in ways that his later career made unmistakably clear. He commanded irregular forces under conditions of extreme difficulty against an enemy that fought by rules different from European military convention. He was shot at repeatedly and remained uninjured, a fact he noted with a mixture of factual observation and providential interpretation that would recur throughout his life. He developed the physical endurance and mental composure under fire that would define him as a military commander 3 decades later. He developed a deep and abiding resentment of British military condescension, the contempt with which British regular officers treated colonial militia, the patronizing assumption that Americans were lesser soldiers and lesser men than the professional soldiers of the crown. That would inform his political evolution in the decades between the French and Indian War and the Revolution. He also developed something more subtle and more important. He developed an understanding of his own limitations. Washington was not, by any objective military assessment, a tactical genius. He lost more battles than he won. His military instincts were sometimes sound and sometimes disastrously wrong. What he possessed, in quantities that genuine tactical genius cannot always guarantee, was strategic patience, physical courage, and the ability to hold an army together through conditions that destroyed lesser organizations. Not through inspirational speeches or brilliant maneuver, but through sheer, relentless, implacable presence. Washington's army survived because Washington survived. Because he was always there. Because his soldiers could look across a frozen encampment or a chaotic retreat and see him, large, impassive, seemingly unmoved by conditions that were breaking other men, and draw from his composure the composure they could not independently generate. He also possessed something that no tactical manual could teach. He understood legitimacy, not as a legal abstraction, as a practical necessity, as the foundation on which everything he was trying to build depended. Washington had watched what happened when military force operated without civilian sanction, in the brutal frontier conflicts of the 1750s, in the behavior of British troops in occupied American cities, in the history of every republic that had ever been destroyed by its own army. He had read enough history to know what military coups produced. He had enough self-knowledge to understand that the republic he was fighting to create could not survive if its creation required its principles to be violated. These convictions would be tested at Newburgh with a severity that no other moment in his life would match. Page 3. The American Revolution was for most of its duration a disaster being managed rather than a victory being achieved. This is the truth that the gilded mythology of founding era history consistently obscures. Washington took command of the Continental Army in July 1775, appointed by the Continental Congress in a decision whose political logic was as important as its military calculus. The Virginia planter and militia veteran was chosen not solely because he was the most qualified military commander available, but because the Congress, navigating the delicate politics of a rebellion that had begun in New England, but needed to become a continental cause, required a commander from the South. Washington arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to find an army that was simultaneously inspiring and appalling, filled with brave, committed men who had no uniforms, limited ammunition, expiring enlistments, and the collective military discipline of an enthusiastic volunteer organization that had never been tested by prolonged professional warfare. He set about creating something from almost nothing. The early years of the war were a chronicle of narrow escapes, tactical reverses, and the constant, grinding challenge of keeping an army in existence against the combined pressures of British military superiority, congressional financial inadequacy, and the natural human tendency of soldiers to go home when things are going badly. The fall of New York in 1776, a campaign that demonstrated the limitations of militia against professional regular troops with brutal efficiency, costing Washington the city, and very nearly costing him his army and his command, was followed by a retreat across New Jersey that stripped the Continental Army to remnant of its paper strength, and persuaded most neutral observers in America and Europe that the revolution was effectively over. It was not over. The crossing of the Delaware on the night of December 5 to 26, 1776, one of the most audacious military operations in American military history, transformed the momentum of the war with a stroke that combined tactical boldness with the kind of theatrical timing that Washington, consciously or not, seemed to understand the revolution needed as much as it needed military victory. The attack on Trenton, followed by the battle at Princeton, demonstrated that the Continental Army could act offensively, could defeat British regular forces in the field, and could survive the reverses that had seemed terminal only weeks before. The victories were modest in strictly military terms. Their effect on American morale, and on the international perception of the revolution's viability, was enormous. But the pattern that established itself in 1776, crisis, near collapse, narrow rescue, would repeat itself with exhausting regularity for the next 5 years. Valley Forge in the winter of 1770-1778 stands as the revolution's most famous ordeal, and the mythology that surrounds it is, for once, not significantly exaggerated. The Continental Army that endured that winter at the encampment des miles northwest of Philadelphia, where the British were wintering in comfort in the captured American capital, suffered a casualty rate from disease, exposure, and starvation that rivaled the losses of major battles. Soldiers went barefoot in the snow because the quartermaster system had failed to provide shoes. Men died of conditions that adequate supply and basic medical care would have prevented. Washington, writing to Congress from Valley Forge with a precision and restraint that barely concealed his fury, described an army on the edge of dissolution, and a supply system so comprehensively broken that calling it a supply system was an act of terminological charity. He did not abandon his army. He never abandoned his army. This was, in the calculus of military loyalty, that would become so critical at Newburgh, the most important fact about George Washington. Through 8 years of war, through defeats and retreats and the quiet daily humiliation of commanding an army that the government it served could not adequately clothe, feed, or pay, Washington remained. He shared the conditions of his men to a degree that exceeded expectation and fell short of what he publicly claimed. But that was real enough to be visible, real enough to build the bond of mutual endurance that made the Continental Army, against all probability, into the force that won the revolution. The French alliance, secured by Benjamin Franklin's diplomacy and formalized after the American victory at Saratoga in October 1777, transformed the strategic situation. French money, French troops, and, most critically, French naval power provided the combination of resources that the Continental Army had never possessed independently. The Yorktown campaign of 1781, the siege that ended the war, was a Franco-American operation whose decisive element was the French fleet's victory at the Battle of the Chesapeake, cutting off Cornwallis's army from British naval relief and making surrender inevitable. Washington's contribution to Yorktown was real and significant, but the revolution was won not by American military power alone, but by the alliance that American diplomacy and American perseverance had made possible. By 1782, the war was over in everything but the paperwork. The paperwork was taking too long, and the army, camped in Newburgh, had stopped being patient. Paragraph page 4. Rasutopa or TTMHA man. By the winter of 1782, George Washington was not merely a military commander. He was something unprecedented in American life, and nearly unprecedented in the modern world, a living symbol. A man whose public image had been so thoroughly transformed by 8 years of war, by propaganda, by the genuine admiration of soldiers who had served under him, and by the deliberate myth-making of a revolution that needed heroes. That distinguishing the historical Washington from the symbolic Washington had become almost impossible even for people who knew him personally. The adulation was genuine, and Washington both cultivated it and was made uncomfortable by it. He understood, with the political intelligence that his admirers sometimes missed because it operated beneath an exterior of soldierly plainness, that his power was inseparable from his reputation, that the deference he received from Congress, from foreign governments, from his own officers, from the American public, the deference that made him the indispensable man of the revolution, rested on the perception that he was different from other men who held power, that he was not ambitious in the ordinary sense, that he had not sought power but had accepted it as a duty, that he would relinquish it when the duty was complete. This perception was not entirely false. Washington genuinely did believe in republican government. He genuinely did distrust the concentrated power that monarchy represented. He had spent too many years fighting a king's authority to wish to substitute his own. But Washington was also a man of his time and his class. A Virginia planter of the 18th century, accustomed to deference, accustomed to command, accustomed to the assumption that men of his standing would naturally occupy positions of authority. The line between his genuine republican conviction and his equally genuine personal pride was not always clearly drawn, even to himself. What was unambiguously clear was the loyalty his army gave him. Officers who had served with Washington through the worst years of the war did not merely respect him. They revered him with an intensity that bordered on the religious. He had been there at Valley Forge, when other commanders had found reasons to be elsewhere. He had shared their cold and their hunger, not completely, not as private soldiers shared them, but visibly enough to matter. He had fought for their interests with Congress, repeatedly, and with documented frustration, complaining in letters whose candor about congressional failure was remarkable for a man who maintained public discretion in most things. He had never sacrificed them for his own advantage. He had never taken a salary. He had asked only that his expenses be reimbursed. He had given the revolution everything he had. And now, in the encampment at Newburgh, his officers were preparing to ask him to give it one thing more. They were preparing to ask him to use that loyalty. The profound tested battle, forged loyalty of an army that would follow him anywhere, to take what the Congress had refused to give. The men behind the Newburgh conspiracy were not villains by the ordinary definitions. They were frustrated, legitimate grievances organized by men who had tried patience and found it exhausted. The central figures were officers of genuine distinction. Men who had served bravely, who had real claims on the gratitude of the nation, and who had watched the Congress fail to honor those claims with a consistency that had cured them of faith in the political process. Among them was Major General Horatio Gates, the victor of Saratoga, The officer whose moment of triumph in 1777 had briefly made him a rival to Washington's position as the revolution's central military figure. A man whose relationship with Washington carried the complicated residue of that earlier competition. Around Gates gathered a circle of officers who were willing to contemplate what more loyal Washington subordinates were not: a direct confrontation between military power and congressional authority. There were also civilian figures involved. Men within the Congress and within the orbit of those who wanted a stronger national government, who saw in the Army's grievances a potential lever. If the Army's threat of non-disbandment frightened the states into granting the Congress the revenue-raising powers it lacked, the result would be a stronger national government capable of meeting its obligations. Robert Morris, the financier of the revolution, and his associates were not indifferent to the possibility that a controlled military crisis might produce the constitutional reform that straightforward political argument had failed to achieve. The conspiracy, in other words, had multiple authors with different intentions. Only one man's decision would determine what it became. Paragraph 5. 8 Mas Painand, A and Owok Ahaling Inc. The Newburgh conspiracy crystallized in the early months of 1783 around a set of anonymous documents that appeared in the Army's camp with the calculated precision of a political operation. The first document, later known as the Newburgh Address, was addressed to the officers of the Continental Army, and presented the case for direct action with a rhetorical skill that had clearly been prepared by someone of considerable political sophistication. It was anonymous. It was inflammatory. And it was, in its essential argument, not entirely wrong. The document began by reminding the officers of everything they had sacrificed: the years of service, the unpaid wages, the broken promises, the comfortable lives set aside for the cold, and the blood, and the endless frustration of fighting for a government that could not or would not meet its obligations. It rehearsed the litany of congressional failure with prosecutorial precision, building its emotional case with the relentless accumulation of legitimate grievances. And then, it delivered its conclusion that the officers would be fools to trust the Congress any further. That the Army's only leverage was its continued existence under arms. That if peace came before their claims were settled, the Army would disband. The soldiers would return to civilian life, and the Congress would heave a sigh of relief, and forget every promise it had ever made. The alternative proposed was military coercion. If the Congress would not pay, the Army would not disband. If the war continued, the Army would fight and manage. From its position of military strength, the terms on which peace would be made and the government reformed. If peace came before redress, the Army should withdraw to the western wilderness, beyond the reach of congressional authority, and leave the civil government to manage its own defense. The language was carefully designed to stop just short of explicit treason while making its meaning unmistakable to every officer who read it. This was not a petition, it was a threat. The question hanging over every tent in the Newburgh encampment was the same question that had hung over every military civilian confrontation in the history of Republican government. What would the general do? Washington's initial response was characteristically calculated. He did not ignore the Newburgh Address. He did not endorse it. He did not immediately and publicly condemn it, in terms that would humiliate the officers whose grievances he genuinely shared. Instead, he moved with the political precision that his reputation for plain soldierly simplicity tended to obscure. He called a meeting of the officer corps, setting the date for March 15, 1783, a date that he chose partly to pre the meeting that the conspirators had been planning to call themselves. By summoning the officers himself, he took control of the process. By setting his own agenda, he denied the conspirators the initiative they had been counting on. He also made clear, through back channels and personal communications, that he intended to address the assembly himself. What he would say when he faced those men. His men, the officers who had served under him for 8 years, whose grievances he had shared, and whose loyalty he had received, and who were now, in their exhaustion and fury, preparing to do something that would destroy everything they had collectively fought to build, was not yet publicly known. The fate of the American Republic was, in the most literal sense imaginable, going to be decided by a speech. Paragraph 6. T. Crassus teach tempi of valu anthsp each tiatidrp March 15, 1783. The building was called the Temple, a large wooden structure built by the soldiers themselves to serve as a dance hall and officers' meeting place, the grandest building in the Newburgh encampment. Which was not saying much. It was cold. It was winter still in the Hudson Valley, the ground frozen, the trees bare, the sky the flat gray of early spring in upstate New York. The officers who filed into the temple that morning were not in ceremonial mood. They were angry men who had come to hear what their commanding general had to say, before deciding what they were going to do. Washington walked in. He was imposing in the way that men of genuine physical presence are imposing, 6 feet 2 inches tall in an era when the average man stood 5 feet 7, broad-shouldered, with the posture of a man who had spent decades in the saddle, and the bearing of someone accustomed to rooms that rearranged themselves around his arrival. He had worn his uniform. He was, as he always was in public, composed. He began to speak. He addressed the grievances directly, because to dismiss them would have been dishonest, and Washington understood that his credibility with these men rested on a foundation of shared experience that demanded honesty. He acknowledged the failures of Congress. He acknowledged the justice of the officers' claims. He did not pretend that the situation was other than what it was. And then he turned. He appealed to their honor, to the meaning of what they had built together, to what history would say about the Continental Army, the force that had won a revolution in the name of Republican government, if it chose, at the moment of victory, to destroy the republic it had created. He asked them to imagine how the enemies of the American experiment would use a military coup against the government of the United States. How every monarch in Europe who had predicted that a Britain government was a fantasy would receive the news. How the cause of human liberty, the cause that Washington genuinely believed the American Revolution represented, not merely for Americans, but for all people everywhere, would be set back by an act that proved its critics right. He spoke for some time. And then he reached for a letter. He had brought with him a letter from a member of Congress. A letter attempting to explain, sympathetically, the political difficulties that were preventing the Congress from acting on the Army's claims. He wanted to read it aloud, to give the officers some evidence that their situation was at least understood in Philadelphia, if not yet remedied. He looked at the letter. He could not read it. The man who had ridden through cannon fire at Monmouth, who had crossed the Delaware in a blizzard, who had stood unmoved at Valley Forge. This man reached into his pocket and produced a pair of spectacles. He paused. He looked at his officers, the men who had never seen him show weakness of any kind, for whom his physical presence and implacable composure had been, for 8 years, one of the revolution's essential pillars. And he said, quietly, with a simplicity that no prepared speech could have achieved, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray but almost blind in the service of my country." Several officers began to weep. The moment was not calculated, or if it was calculated with a genius for human truth that transcended ordinary political manipulation. Washington had spent 8 years projecting strength. In this moment, in this room, surrounded by men who were preparing to betray their public, he had spent his life serving. He put on a pair of spectacles and admitted that the service had cost him something. It cost him nothing to admit it. It cost the conspiracy everything. He finished reading the letter. He finished his speech. He left the temple. What happened next was decisive. The officers voted to reject the Newburgh address. They voted to express their confidence in Congress and their commitment to the civil authority they had sworn to serve. They voted, in effect, to remain soldiers of a republic rather than become the instruments of a coup. The conspiracy was over, not because it lacked grievances, not because it lacked capable, committed men willing to act on those grievances, but because the one man whose participation could have made it succeed had refused, and because in refusing, had demonstrated, with a pair of spectacles and a single sentence, something about his own character and his own humanity that no conspiracy could survive. The Republic had been saved by a man admitting he needed reading glasses. History is sometimes exactly this strange. Washington resigned his commission on December 23, 1783. The war had formally ended with the Treaty of Paris signed in September. The British had withdrawn. The Continental Army had been demobilized. Washington had one final official act to perform, the surrender of the military authority that Congress had granted him 8.5 years earlier. In the summer of 1775, when the revolution was barely weeks, outcome was entirely uncertain. He performed it in Annapolis, Maryland, where the Congress was then sitting, in a ceremony that was brief, emotional, and in the understanding of the people who witnessed it, historically extraordinary. King George III of Britain, informed that Washington intended to resign his command and return to private life, reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." He did it. The response to Washington's resignation in America and in Europe was precisely what George III had anticipated. In a world where every historical precedent, Caesar, Cromwell, every general who ever commanded a victorious army, pointed toward the conversion of military power into personal political authority, Washington's voluntary relinquishment of command was so unprecedented that many European observers could not initially believe it was genuine. The Roman general Cincinnatus, who had famously returned to his farm after being called to save the Republic, had become a cultural touchstone in the classical tradition that educated Americans revered, and Washington's conscious embrace of the Cincinnatus role was not coincidental. He understood what his retirement meant symbolically. He understood that in walking away from power, he was giving the American Republic something more valuable than any victory he had won on the battlefield. He was giving it a model, a demonstration that Republican government could survive its greatest test. The moment when the man with the army decides what to do with it, and emerge intact. He returned to Mount Vernon. He farmed. He managed his plantation and his enslaved workforce. The dimension of Washington's life that the mythology has always had difficulty incorporating. The fact that the man who embodied Republican liberty owned over 300 human beings who had no liberty at all. He received visitors. He conducted correspondence. He watched, with increasing alarm, as the government he had fought to establish demonstrated, year by year, an alarming inability to actually govern. The Articles of Confederation were not working. The Congress and Washington had spent 8 years serving, and whose failures he had documented in letters of barely suppressed fury throughout the war, was proving in peace to be no more effective than it had been in wartime. The states were quarreling over commerce and borders. The national debt was unpaid. Foreign powers were testing American resolve and finding it wanting. Shays' Rebellion, an uprising of indebted Massachusetts farmers in 1786 that the national government was powerless to suppress, that demonstrated with alarming clarity that the Republic Washington had risked to create was drifting toward the kind of disorder that historically preceded either authoritarianism or collapse. Washington came out of retirement. He attended the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, attending initially as a delegate, serving ultimately as the convention's presiding officer, his presence lending legitimacy to an enterprise that was, technically, far exceeding its mandate by scrapping the Articles of Confederation entirely and drafting a new constitution. The delegates who gathered in Philadelphia understood that the constitution they were designing would be ratified or rejected partly on the basis of who would serve as the first president under its provisions. They designed the executive branch, historians have long noted, with Washington specifically in mind, trusting that a man of his demonstrated character would not abuse the powers they were granting, and that his initial occupancy of the office would set precedents that would constrain his successors. He was elected unanimously. Twice. He served 2 terms. He stepped down. The precedent of the 2-term presidency, maintained by every president until Franklin Roosevelt, in the extraordinary circumstances of the Second World War, was Washington's final gift to the republic he had served. Not because the Constitution required it. It did not. But because Washington understood, with the same instinct that had guided him at Newburgh, that the republic needed the demonstration, needed to see the most powerful man in America choose again, to walk away, to believe that the experiment could survive its own success. Para ATSCIN Rafale THKICT at Media Irrepuelike. History is made of choices. Most of them are invisible, made in private moments, by people whose names the historical record did not preserve, whose decisions shaped the world without leaving sufficient trace to be recovered. The choices that history does record are often the spectacular ones, the battles, The declarations, the assassinations, the revolutionary acts of violence or courage that cracked the old world open and let the new one begin to form. The choice George Washington made at Newburgh in March of 1783 was not spectacular. He gave a speech, he put on his spectacles. He asked his officers to honor the principles they had fought for them, they rather betrayed them, for the immediate satisfaction of legitimate grievances that Congress would eventually, grudgingly, partially address. That was all. And yet the argument can be made, has been made, by historians across 2 centuries of American scholarship, that this choice was the most consequential single act in American political history. More consequential than the Declaration of Independence, which articulated the principles of the Republic but did not ensure its survival. More consequential than the Constitutional Convention, which designed the Republic's governing structure, but could not guarantee that structure would function. The Newburgh moment was the moment when everything that the revolution had claimed to stand for, the principle that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that military force is the servant of civil authority, and not its master, was tested against the most powerful argument that opposing principle has ever had. A victorious army with legitimate grievances and the physical power to redress them by force. Washington said no. The precedent he established at Newburgh ran forward through American history as a current beneath the surface of the Republic's development. Invisible in ordinary times, essential in extraordinary ones. American civil-military relations, for all their complexities and occasional tensions, have never produced the military coup that the Newburgh conspiracy contemplated. The norm of civilian control, the principle that generals serve presidents, that the military serves the government, that the sword is the instrument of the law and not its replacement, has been stressed and tested and at moments strained. It has never broken. It has never produced the Caesar that Hamilton feared, the Cromwell that Madison's political philosophy was designed to prevent. This is not accidental, it is the accumulated weight of Newburgh. The institutional memory, sometimes unconscious, sometimes explicit, of what Washington chose and why he chose it, and what the choice meant for the kind of country the United States would become. There is a famous story. Its historical authenticity is uncertain, but its meaning is not, that a man named Colonel Louis Nicola wrote to Washington in 1782, suggesting that Washington accept the kingship of the new nation. Nicola's argument was practical. The Republic was weak, the government was ineffective. What America needed was the stability of monarchy under a proven leader. Washington's response, in a letter whose controlled fury beneath its courtly language is unmistakable, was absolute rejection. He expressed the strongest possible disapproval of such ideas. He said they were painful to him to hear. He asked Nicola never to raise the subject again. He never accepted the crown that was, in the spring of 1783, being held out to him. Not because it was not offered. Not because no one wanted him to take it. But because Washington had decided, long before Newburgh and long before Nicola's letter, what kind of man he was going to be, and what kind of country he was going to help build. He had decided that the revolution's meaning was larger than his personal ambition, larger, even, than the legitimate grievances of the army he commanded. That if the Republic was to have any hope of enduring, its first generation of leaders had to demonstrate that the principles they had proclaimed were not merely tactical rhetoric, but genuine convictions that constrained their behavior, even when the constraints were costly. Washington understood something about power that most people who pursue it never learn. The most durable power is the power that has visibly declined to take what it could have seized. Every president who has peacefully transferred power to a successor, every general who has accepted civilian authority over a decision he believed was wrong, every official who has left office when the law required, rather than when ambition preferred, each of them is living in the institutional space that Washington created at Newburgh and confirmed at Annapolis when he handed back his sword. He was 51 years old on the day he resigned his commission. He had gray hair and failing eyesight and 8 years of accumulated exhaustion. He had won a revolution. He had refused a coup. He had turned down a crown. He went home to his farm. In a world where power has always been the most intoxicating drug available to human beings, where the histories of Rome and England and France and every other republic that has turned into something else are written in the stories of the men who could not let go. Washington let go twice. The republic he built has its deep flaws, its persistent contradictions, its long catalogue of failures to live up to the principles it proclaimed. It was built, in part, by enslaved hands whose owners were simultaneously writing documents about liberty. It has produced injustices that its founding ideals condemn. It remains, in the 21st century, a work in progress, an experiment whose outcome is not guaranteed, whose principles must be actively defended rather than passively inherited, whose institutions depend not on their design alone, but on the character of the people who operate them. But it is still here. Still functioning. Still transferring power peacefully. Still, whatever its failures in practice, organized around the principle that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Not from the barrel of a gun, not from the divine right of kings, not from the force of a general's army at the gates of the capital. Still here because, on a cold March morning in 1783, a man put on his spectacles and admitted he had grown old in his country's service, and the officers who had been preparing to seize power looked at him, and remembered who they were. The republic that almost became a monarchy. The general who almost became a king. The moment that made the difference was not a battle. It was a choice. It is always a choice.